You've probably heard a lot over the past few years that buying a home is no longer the financial benefit that it once was. In fact, if you looked at modern calculations, you stand to lose more money buying a home than if you rent one in Canada and in other similar countries, especially recently. Ben Felix, the CIO at PWL Capital, looked at data from 2005 to 2024 and found that in 12 of the major cities in Canada, a renter would be saving money relative to home owning. And then if they invested the difference in low-cost, globally diversified index fund portfolios in 7 of those 12 cities, they would have ended up with more wealth. Now, the end wealth ratio was 0.99, basically indicating that it was a coin flip as to whether or not renters are actually better off than homeowners in Canada. However, despite the evidence that renting can sometimes be the better financial move, Canadians bought around 470,000 homes in 2025, according to the Canadian Real Estate Association, and they're forecasting similar numbers for 2026. So rather than rehashing the rent versus buy debate, today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We're actually going to be looking at the perks of buying a home in 2026, because at the end of the day, home ownership is still the Canadian dream. And there are tons of ways to save money when you buy a home that most people have never heard of. So today we're going to be looking at all the reasons why you should buy a home in Canada in 2026. Reason number 1 is taxes. We're going to cover 3 tax strategies, from the really well-known ones to the lesser-known ones. The first one is pretty obvious. It's the principal residence exemption. With your principal residence, you could buy a $1 million home for $100,000 in real cash, catch an upswing in the market, sell for $1.4 million 2 or 3 years later, and once you factor in your principal payments, walk away with 3.5 times your money completely tax-free. This is the best tax play in Canada, even better than the TFSA, because in Canada, the TFSA does have a limit on how much you can invest tax-sheltered, and therefore takes the leverage benefit completely out of the equation. Now, this is obviously not real life, although for some it was in the early 2020s, but the principle still applies, because this allows anyone who buys a home to then sell it with whatever gain it may acquire over the years of owning completely tax-free. Now, compare that to the renter, capped at $109,000 for their tax-free savings account limit in 2026. Even with the years we've been having in the stock market, if they averaged, let's say 10% in 4 years and continue to max it out in subsequent years, they would still only have about $192,000 available to them tax-free. So I'm also not suggesting here, though, that 10% is even a reasonable expected return. It's not. But in this example, even with exaggerated expected returns, the TFSA falls well short of the combined benefits of easy access to leverage and tax-free sale proceeds that the principal residence exemption allows for. Now, unless you live in Vancouver or Toronto, home appreciation may actually not be the best card to play here, but that's what tax-sheltered accounts come into the equation, which brings me to reason number 2, the FHSA, RRSP, and GST exemptions. Let's start with the FHSA, short for the First Home Savings Account. On the surface, it's pretty simple, but there are a few lesser known details inside of it that most people miss. When you contribute to this account, you get a tax deduction against your earned income. It's just like an RRSP in that respect. As your investments grow, you pay no tax on the returns. And when you take the money out to buy a home, you pay no tax on the withdrawal. And unlike the RRSP and some other accounts, there are no repayment requirements. Now, as great as this account is, it has a few hidden features as well that almost no one talks about. The first is the contribution room. When you open the account, you get $8,000 of room, and you gain another $8,000 each year for 5 total years to a max of $40,000. But here's the thing. You don't have to fill it right away. If you're not planning to buy a home anytime soon, you can still open the account and let the room accumulate for 2 years. The max you can contribute in a 1-year period is $16,000, $8,000 from the prior year and $8,000 for the current year. Now, I'd strongly consider maxing out your FHSA before the RRSP, and here's why. In another lesser known detail about the First Home Savings Account, if you do not end up using it to buy a home, the balance can roll into your RSP without affecting your existing RSP contribution. So even if you've maxed out your RRSP when you don't buy the home, you can roll the FHSA money into the RRSP. Little details like this can save you tens of thousands of dollars by the time you retire. So on top of the First Home Savings Account, there's also the pre-existing home buyers plan with the RRSP. This plan lets you contribute to an RSP. You get a tax deduction on the contribution, and then you can withdraw up to $60,000 completely tax-free to buy your first home. But there is a catch. You do have to repay the withdrawal over 15 years. So while the RSP allows you to withdraw more, there are strings attached. However, this combined with the First Home Savings Account is an amazing 1-2 punch that over a 5-year period can have a couple saving up to $200,000 in tax sheltered accounts withdrawn completely tax-free for their first home purchase. And this has never before been possible. And lastly, there's one more thing to consider: the first-time home buyer's GST rebate. If you buy or build a new home, you don't pay GST as a first-time home buyer. That can save you up to $50,000 on a new build on purchases under $1.5 million. Okay, now something important to note: this only applies to new builds between 2025 through to 2030. So now that you understand tax incentives and sheltered accounts, there are a few minor considerations that can vary depending on where you live. The province of Ontario, for example, refunds up to $4,000 on land transfer taxes. BC exempts you from transfer taxes on a home up to $500,000. If you're obviously ever fortunate enough to find a home under $500,000, I guess this counts, plus a small federal tax credit, saving you about $1,500 at tax time for first-time home buyers. So stacked up, a couple buying a $900,000 new build in 2026 could combine $48,000 of FHSA tax-deductible savings, $120,000 of RSP money tax-free, and $50,000 of GST relief all at once. And if that's not enough to show you why 2026 is the right time to buy a new home, think about the fact that home prices are down 20% since the peak in mid-2022. Now let's move on past the numbers and into something no one wants to talk about in the housing debate, which is stability. Now, if you're someone who rolls their eyes at this and doesn't think it applies to you because you are purely numbers driven, then you definitely need to hear this, because there are statistics here that might surprise you. I'm going to frame this a little bit differently than most people do, because this one isn't about returns at all. It's about who controls your biggest monthly expense and why that matters. Let's go over 3 stats that change depending on if you own or rent a home. When you have a mortgage, your housing costs are largely fixed. You know what your payment is, and yes, it can change at renewal or if you have a variable rate mortgage, but largely you know what your monthly payment is going to be. When you rent, your payment isn't controlled by you. It's repriced based on annual market rent rates. And since renters move more often than homeowners according to CMHC, you are simply subject to market rates just to put a roof over your head for your family. As well, you may be forced to move. According to Stats Canadian Housing Survey, 12% of renters in Canada reported having been evicted from their homes versus just 4% of homeowners. And you might be thinking, well, that's because of non-payment of rent, but you'd be wrong. 37% of the evictions happened because the landlord sold the property, and another 26% because the landlord simply wanted to move back in themselves, meaning you could be doing everything right, paying on time, taking care of the place, and you could still end up being forced to move. Now, if you're thinking that maybe this isn't a fair comparison because of the variable rate situation on homeowners and the rapid interest rate increases from 2023 to 2025, I do have some data for you. First off, the Bank of Canada concluded most households absorbed the rate increases with little issue because of incomes rising at a similar rate and the initial stress test conducted. And then their 2026 financial stability report stated that while 2.5% of non-homeowners were behind on credit accounts, only 1.3% of homeowners were. A Stats Canada survey of financial security in 2023 found that families who owned a home, were approaching retirement, and had a workplace pension had a median net worth of $1.4 million, while those who rented and had no pension only had a net worth of $11,900. Now, you would be right to point out that it's a bit of a faulty conclusion, as it's impossible to determine cause and effect here. Does that simply mean buying a home will make you wealthy? No. Likely the reason is that wealthier people who could afford homes bought them, and less wealthy people with no pensions simply couldn't afford to. But part of what a home does is limit the damage you can inflict on yourself through fixed monthly repayments. It acts as a forced savings method, building equity every month, whether you feel like it or not. Like, I manage wealth for people for a living and can tell you that automatically contributing to build your wealth beats willpower every single time. Okay, reason number 3, and this has nothing to do with money, but actually is probably the most important reason, which is why I kept it until last. And if you're someone who believes only numbers matter, then you definitely need to hear this. In positive psychology, there's a framework for creating a flourishing life. It comes from Dr. Martin Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania, and it's called PERMA. According to Dr. Seligman, there are 5 pillars of a flourishing life, which are positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, and then the last one, accomplishment. Seligman's point about accomplishment is that people will pursue achievements and mastery for its own sake, not for the money, because reaching a goal for the sake of reaching the goal is part of building a good life. For a huge number of Canadians, buying a home is the Canadian dream. Like, I remember when we bought our first home, the feeling of pride and satisfaction was pretty surreal. My parents weren't able to buy their first home until their mid-40s in Toronto, and in my head, it always felt slightly unattainable. So the ability to buy a home at 26 years old felt crazy to me. It was a huge accomplishment. And while I didn't always enjoy being a homeowner in the early 2020s, it felt more peaceful to walk into a home I owned than one I rented. And the stats back this up. Stats Canada measured life satisfaction on a scale of 0 to 10, renters averaging 6.9 and homeowners with a mortgage averaged 7.5. Owners also reported a stronger sense of belonging to their community, and research going back decades links homeownership to more civic engagement, volunteering, and feeling more rooted in their community. However, like all data, if I just leave it here without telling you the whole story, I would be misleading you. When researchers control for income and neighborhood, the satisfaction gap shrinks a lot. There's a Wharton study that found homeowners were no happier than comparable renters and got more pain but no more joy from their homes. And Ben Felix has covered similar research. So it's important to note that buying a house is not a happiness machine. It should not be a purchase for anyone but yourself and your family. When I begin working with new clients, I often find many things that they have purchased not for themselves, but for the respect and appreciation of others. The last thing you need to do on your wealth building journey is build granite countertops for a home you didn't really want to buy for someone who probably doesn't even care to see it. You may think you are impervious to such financial mistakes, that if the numbers don't make sense, you'll never spend money. But in my over a decade as a financial advisor, I've seen more often than not people make silly, avoidable financial mistakes. So is buying a home in 2026 the guaranteed wealth builder it was for our parents? Not at all. The evidence is clear that over the past 20 years, it's been a coin flip whether or not it's been beneficial to own at all. But from the 3 points I listed above, the tax tools available, the market relative to where it was in 2020, principal residence exemption, the government seemingly desperate to get millennials into the housing market, financially speaking, it's definitely a better time than it was 4 years ago. Bigger than that though, if you value stability, be more in control of your financial life, and genuinely want to own a home simply for the sake of owning a home, then 2026 is the year you should consider doing it. If you're looking for guidance on a decision like this or on any part of your financial picture, you can book a call with us through the link below.